The photograph is small, no larger than a folded letter, its edges frayed like they've been worried by too many fingers. A young mother sits near a window, her posture careful, almost ceremonial, the baby asleep against her chest. Light spills across them in a way that feels deliberate, as though the day itself wanted to bear witness. At first glance, there is nothing wrong here, nothing that shouldn't be preserved behind glass and labeled with a date and a place that no longer exists. The year is 1918, the kind of year history remembers for its quiet catastrophes, and yet this image insists on peace. The mother's eyes are lowered, the baby's mouth parted in a soft, untroubled dream. You could believe this is a moment stolen from the storm. Then you look closer. The grain of the photograph thickens near the back wall, where the light thins and the shadows refuse to settle. What appears to be a coat rack, or perhaps the suggestion of one, resolves into something else entirely. There is a shape where no shape should be, a narrowing of darkness that does not match the fall of the light. It has the patience of something that knows time will do its work for it. Once you see it, the peace of the image curdles. The mother's careful posture becomes guarded. The baby's sleep feels less like rest and more like escape. The longer you stare, the more the photograph seems to stare back. The watcher is not obvious, it never is. It exists in the margins, in the place your eyes slide past because they expect nothing there. Yet it has a focus, a direction. It is watching the mother and the child with an attention that feels intimate, almost proprietary. You begin to notice how the shadows lean toward them, how the window's light seems to avoid that corner of the room. The photograph stops being a record and becomes a question, one that tightens in your chest as you realize this moment of peace may have been staged, borrowed, or worse, permitted. And once that thought takes hold, another follows, colder and far more unsettling. If someone was watching then, patiently and unseen, what exactly were they waiting for, and why does it feel as though they've noticed you now? The first true disturbance begins not with the photograph itself, but with the act of trying to save it. The historian receives the image as part of a neglected estate archive, a bundle of unrelated documents tied with brittle twine, the kind of thing that smells faintly of dust and old paper even before it is unwrapped. At a glance, the photograph appears ordinary, almost disappointingly so. A mother seated near a window, a baby asleep in her arms, the date 1918 penciled faintly on the back. It is the sort of image that exists by the thousands, preserved less for its content than for the comfort it offers, a reminder that even in years of catastrophe, people still paused to hold their children. The historian's intention is practical and unemotional. Clean it, stabilize it, digitize it before time finishes what neglect has started. The restoration process begins gently. High-resolution scans are taken, each pass revealing more texture than the naked eye can manage. Scratches soften, creases flatten, and the haze caused by age recedes. With every incremental improvement, the photograph grows sharper, more present, as though it is stepping closer out of the past. The mother's expression becomes clearer, and with it a subtle tension that wasn't visible before. Her mouth is relaxed, but her jaw is set. Her eyes are lowered, not tenderly, but deliberately, as if refusing to look at something just beyond the frame. This is noted, but not yet feared. Old photographs often betray emotions their subjects never intended to record. It is during a contrast correction that the anomaly first appears. A cluster of darker pixels near the back wall behaves strangely under enhancement, deepening rather than separating, forming a density that doesn't align with the room's geometry. At first, it is dismissed as a chemical irregularity, the kind caused by uneven exposure or aging emulsions. The historian has seen this before. Still, something about the shape resists easy classification. It is not random. It has an internal consistency, a weight that feels intentional. When the surrounding shadows are adjusted, they obey the light. This one does not. Curiosity replaces routine. Additional scans are made using different wavelengths, infrared to penetrate surface damage, ultraviolet to map chemical residue. With each scan, the form becomes more insistent. It is still incomplete, still deniable, but it now suggests depth, as though something occupies space within the photograph rather than merely resting on it. The historian leans closer to the screen, aware of a creeping unease that has nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with pattern recognition. The human mind is built to notice when something almost makes sense but doesn't quite. That tension is where fear begins. The figure does not resemble a person in any straightforward way. There is no clear face, no distinct limbs, yet there is a posture, a vertical presence that implies attention. It stands behind the mother and child, offset just enough to remain peripheral. What unsettles most is not what can be seen, but what is implied by the way the grain gathers around it, as if the photograph itself is accommodating the shape, making room. The historian attempts to isolate the area, to break it down into pixels and probabilities, but the more it is examined, the more cohesive it becomes. Noise should scatter. This does not. Rational explanations are exhausted one by one. It is not a double exposure. The layers don't overlap correctly. It is not damage. The surrounding emulsion is intact. It is not a reflection. The angle is wrong, the light source inconsistent. Each discarded theory leaves behind a residue of doubt. The historian begins to feel that the photograph is resisting interpretation, not in a mystical sense, but in a way that suggests it contains information never meant to be extracted. There is a subtle shift in the way the image is approached after that, less like an object and more like a boundary. The most disturbing realization comes slowly, almost reluctantly. When the image is reverted to an earlier scan and then compared to the enhanced version, the shape is still there, but it is less defined, as though it has sharpened in response to attention. This should not be possible. Restoration reveals what already exists, it does not create new structure. Yet the later scans show clearer edges, a more confident outline. The historian repeats the process, documenting every step, every setting, trying to catch the moment where imagination might be intruding. But the data remains stubbornly consistent. The figure becomes more legible the longer it is studied. There is a moment, late at night, when the historian notices something that finally strips away detachment. The mother's lowered gaze aligns almost perfectly with the position of the shape. She is not looking at her child. She is looking down and away, in the precise direction of where the watcher stands. The realization lands with a physical weight, tightening the chest, slowing the breath. This is no longer about hidden artifacts or historical curiosity. The photograph is no longer passive. It is recording an interaction, one that the subjects were aware of and the camera captured without understanding. From that point on, the image feels unstable. Not visually, but psychologically. The historian becomes aware of a growing reluctance to leave the scan open on the screen, an irrational sense that prolonged exposure is a kind of invitation. Each attempt to minimize the window brings a fleeting impression of movement, not within the image itself, but in the way the eye expects it to change. The figure does not move, yet it feels increasingly present, as though clarity is a form of proximity. The restoration, intended to preserve a moment of peace, has instead peeled back a layer of concealment, revealing that the tranquility was conditional, observed, and possibly granted only for the duration of the shutter's open eye, and the historian begins to understand that by uncovering the watcher, they may have completed something that was never finished in 1918, because some moments do not stay contained when they are finally seen, and some witnesses do not forget the attention they were denied for so long. The search for context begins as a way to ground unease in paperwork. After the restoration reveals more questions than answers, the historian turns to records, convinced that dates and names will do what logic has failed to accomplish. The photograph's backing provides only fragments, a town name written in an outdated hand, the year confirmed as 1918, and a faint stamp indicating a temporary medical facility. That detail seems innocuous at first, almost expected for the period, but it opens a corridor into a different kind of history, one written hastily and often incompletely, because there was never enough time. Influenza did not wait for careful documentation. It moved faster than ink. Local archives are thin, many lost to fires, floods, or simple neglect, but hospital transfer logs still exist in pieces, scattered across municipal basements and microfilm reels. The historian begins to trace the facility named on the photograph, discovering it was not a hospital in the traditional sense but a converted schoolhouse used during the peak of the epidemic. It functioned briefly, overwhelmed almost immediately, then shut down just as abruptly. Officially, it closed due to lack of staff and supplies. Unofficially, the notes become vague, using phrases like evacuation completed and patients reassigned, language that suggests resolution without ever quite proving it. As the historian cross-references names from intake lists with death registries, discrepancies begin to surface. Several individuals admitted to the facility do not appear in any burial records, nor do they reappear in census data or discharge summaries. They simply stop. At first, this seems like a familiar archival problem, the result of misspellings or lost pages, but the pattern repeats too consistently. The missing are not random. They are clustered around a narrow window of time, a 3-day span during which the schoolhouse was reportedly evacuated under emergency conditions. Newspaper clippings from the period provide atmosphere but little clarity. Headlines speak of overcrowding, of nurses collapsing from exhaustion, of entire families arriving together and leaving altered or not at all. One brief article mentions an overnight transfer prompted by structural concerns, though no follow-up explains what those concerns were. Another refers to patients being moved before dawn, a curious detail that seems unnecessary unless someone felt the need to justify the timing. The historian begins to notice how often the language avoids specifics, how carefully it steps around whatever truly occurred. One name in particular stands out, written in the same looping script found on the photograph's backing. The mother. She appears in the intake ledger, admitted with her infant, both listed as stable. The next entry notes a scheduled transfer to another facility outside town. There is no arrival record at the destination, no discharge note, no death certificate. The baby's name appears later, however, in a different county's orphan registry, placed there weeks after the evacuation. The mother's name does not accompany it. This asymmetry troubles the historian more than the absence itself. Children separated from parents during epidemics was tragically common, but paperwork usually reflected that separation in some form. Here, the mother vanishes cleanly, as if erased between one line and the next. The historian begins to wonder if the photograph was taken shortly before the evacuation, perhaps as a keepsake, perhaps as a quiet act of defiance against the chaos pressing in on all sides. If so, the watcher's presence takes on a different weight. It was there before the disappearance, not as a consequence of it. Further examination of the evacuation reveals more anomalies. According to the official timeline, patients were moved in stages, prioritized by severity. Yet eyewitness letters preserved in private collections suggest panic, describing staff ordered to leave certain wards untouched until last, despite the risk. One nurse writes of being told not to look back, of curtains drawn hastily, of doors closed that should have remained open. Another letter mentions a child crying long after the room had been emptied, though the writer insists no one was left inside. These accounts are dismissed in official histories as stress-induced distortions, but the consistency of the unease is difficult to ignore. The historian begins to map the disappearances against the layout of the schoolhouse using old blueprints. The missing patients were all housed in rooms along the same corridor, the one farthest from the main entrance, the one converted from a storage wing never meant to hold people. The photograph's background matches this area precisely. The wall, the narrow window, the odd angle of light all align with that forgotten section of the building. The watcher's position in the image corresponds to where the corridor bends, a blind spot where supervision would have been weakest. What unsettles the historian most is not the implication of neglect, but the suggestion of selection. Why were some patients transferred and others erased from the record? Why does the baby survive when the mother does not? The documents offer no answers, only absences that feel deliberate. It begins to seem as though the evacuation was less a rescue than a sorting, a moment when decisions were made under pressure that no one later wanted to explain. The watcher, once a visual anomaly, now feels embedded in the event itself, a constant presence during a time when oversight failed and accountability dissolved. As nights stretch longer over stacks of paper and glowing screens, the historian becomes aware of a shift in perspective. The photograph no longer feels like a clue discovered after the fact, but like a witness that arrived early and waited. The watcher was there during the ward's final hours, observing as order collapsed into urgency, as names were crossed out or never written down at all. The mother's lowered gaze begins to make a terrible kind of sense. She may have understood, in that suspended moment, that evacuation did not mean salvation for everyone, and that whatever stood behind her had already decided which of them would leave and which would remain, and that the photograph captured not peace but the stillness that falls when people realize they are being counted by something that does not intend to keep a record in any human sense. The first sound is so faint that it almost escapes notice, a thin irregularity buried beneath the expected hum of scanning equipment and digital interference. The historian initially assumes it is a flaw in the recording chain, a stray vibration from the building or a software artifact generated during file conversion. Old machines, like old photographs, often produce ghosts of their own. Still, the sound does not behave like static. It has rhythm. Not a clean, repeating loop, but a subtle rise and fall, uneven in a way that suggests something organic rather than mechanical. The audio anomaly is discovered accidentally. In an effort to document every aspect of the restoration, the historian records screen captures with synchronized system audio, a habit formed during previous projects involving fragile media. When reviewing the footage late at night, headphones on, the historian notices a barely perceptible sound emerging during the deepest contrast passes. It is easiest to hear when the image is pushed to extremes, when shadows are stretched and highlights compressed, as though the photograph resists being forced into clarity. The sound fades when the image returns to neutral, then resurfaces when the manipulation resumes. At first, it resembles breath-fogging cold air, a soft exhale followed by a pause that is just slightly too long. The historian pauses the playback, rewinds, listens again. The sound is still there, consistent in its inconsistency. It does not align with mouse movements or keyboard input. It does not register on the room's ambient noise profile. When the historian removes the headphones, the room is silent, the kind of silence that makes one aware of their own breathing. Putting the headphones back on introduces an unsettling contrast, as though the sound belongs to a space adjacent to the room rather than within it. Rational explanations are pursued methodically. The audio drivers are updated. The recording software is replaced. A different computer is used, in a different room, at a different time of day. Each change alters the background noise but not the anomaly. The breathing remains tied to the image, surfacing only when the scan reaches certain tonal thresholds. The historian isolates the audio track, visualizing it as a waveform. Peaks and troughs emerge that mirror the shape of inhalation and exhalation, imperfect and slightly strained. This is no longer something that can be dismissed as coincidence. What unsettles the historian most is the timing. The breath does not accompany the entire image. It coincides precisely with the area where the watcher stands. As the scan line passes over that region, the sound grows marginally louder, then recedes as the focus moves away. It is as though the photograph is producing sound not as a whole, but as a response to attention directed at a specific presence within it. The historian tests this by masking other areas, scanning only fragments. The breathing follows the watcher's position with unnerving fidelity. Sleep becomes difficult after that. The historian begins to hear phantom echoes of the sound even when the equipment is powered down, catching themselves holding their breath unconsciously, as though listening for something just behind it. During the day, the rational mind reasserts control, insisting that stress and suggestion are sufficient explanations. At night, alone with the soft glow of the monitor, that confidence erodes. The sound feels intimate, invasive in a way images are not supposed to be. Photographs record light, not air. They do not inhale. Driven by a need to disprove the impossible, the historian consults specialists, framing the issue in technical terms. An audio engineer suggests electromagnetic interference, though admits the pattern is unusual. A software developer proposes compression artifacts, then retracts the idea after hearing the isolated track. No one is willing to say what the sound resembles, but no one denies the resemblance either. There is a shared reluctance, a hesitation to give the phenomenon a name that might solidify it into something more than an anomaly. The historian begins to notice variations in the breathing. On some scans, it is shallow, almost tentative. On others, it deepens, accompanied by a faint rasp at the edge of hearing, like air passing through something narrow or obstructed. Once, during a prolonged session, the breathing seems to pause altogether, stretching into a silence so complete that the historian removes the headphones abruptly, heart racing, convinced something has gone wrong. When the sound resumes, it does so with a sharp intake that feels startlingly close, as if the space between listener and source has collapsed. There is a moment, unplanned and irreversible, when the historian plays the audio back while staring directly at the watcher's outline on the screen. The effect is immediate and overwhelming. The breathing synchronizes with the historian's own before diverging, falling out of step in a way that produces a sudden sense of being observed rather than observing. The historian becomes acutely aware of their posture, of the rise and fall of their chest, of the absurd vulnerability of sitting alone in a quiet room listening to something that should not exist. The photograph no longer feels static. It feels attentive. After that, the sound begins to change when noticed. Attempts to record it openly result in diminished clarity, as though it retreats from direct scrutiny. When the historian pretends to ignore it, focusing on unrelated tasks while the scan runs in the background, the breathing returns, steadier, more pronounced. This behavior defies every principle of digital media, yet it repeats often enough to establish a pattern. Attention, it seems, is not neutral. It provokes response. The historian starts to understand the audio not as a byproduct of the scanning process, but as a trace of something that was present when the photograph was taken, something that occupied the same space as the mother and child. Breath leaves no mark on film, yet here it is, encoded indirectly through distortion and shadow, surfacing only when the image is forced to reveal more than it should. The watcher was not silent. It was breathing then, close enough for its presence to be felt, and the photograph captured that proximity in a way technology was never designed to translate until now, when the tools have finally become sensitive enough to hear what was always there, waiting for someone to listen at first. The change is dismissed as fatigue-induced misperception, the kind that creeps in when too many hours are spent staring at the same image. The historian notices it during a routine comparison between saved files, opening an early restoration beside a later one to document progress. The mother and child remain identical, every crease and highlight aligned perfectly, but the watcher does not. Its outline appears subtly repositioned, no more than a few pixels difference, yet enough to alter its relationship to the room. In the earlier scan, it stands farther back, partially absorbed by shadow. In the later version, it seems closer to the mother's shoulder, its presence more assertive, less willing to be mistaken for background noise. The historian double-checks file integrity, confirming that no cropping or scaling errors occurred. Metadata matches. Resolution is identical. The room's geometry has not shifted. Only the watcher's placement has changed, and not randomly. The adjustment suggests intention, a minute correction rather than a drift. When the historian overlays the two versions and toggles between them rapidly, the effect is unsettling, like watching something lean forward when it thinks no one is looking. The movement is not fluid, but incremental, occurring between acts of attention rather than during them. Further comparisons reveal a pattern. Each time the photograph is subjected to deeper analysis, more scrutiny, more exposure, the watcher's position advances. It never crosses into full visibility. It respects the boundary of plausibility, remaining just obscure enough to invite denial. But its proximity increases, narrowing the distance between itself and the living subjects of the image. The historian begins to chart these changes, mapping pixel shifts against timestamps and levels of enhancement. The correlation is undeniable. Attention functions like a lever, and the watcher responds to its application. This realization reframes every prior unease. The audio anomalies, the sharpening outline, the resistance to categorization all begin to align around a single, troubling premise: the watcher is not fixed within the photograph. It is contingent. It behaves less like a recorded artifact and more like an entity using the image as a medium, a surface through which it can register awareness. The historian is careful not to think in supernatural terms, but language fails to provide alternatives that feel honest. No known process allows an image to alter itself in response to observation. Attempts are made to test the phenomenon under controlled conditions. The photograph is duplicated, copied bit for bit, and stored in separate directories. One version is left untouched for days. The other is opened repeatedly, examined, zoomed, analyzed. When the historian returns to compare them, the difference is unmistakable. In the neglected file, the watcher remains distant, diffuse. In the handled version, it has crept closer still, its shape darker, its edges more confident. The implication is chilling. Interaction matters. Neglect enforces stasis. Attention invites approach. The historian begins to experience a growing reluctance to look directly at the image. There is a sense, difficult to articulate, that observation is not passive, that seeing constitutes participation. This feeling is reinforced when the watcher's position shifts again after a prolonged session of focused study. This time, the change is accompanied by a heightened audio response, the breathing louder, nearer, almost synchronized with the moment of recognition. The historian pulls back instinctively, heart racing, the rational mind scrambling to reassert control. Sleep deprivation compounds the fear, but does not create it. Even after rest, the pattern persists. The watcher does not move when the image is glanced at briefly. It advances only during sustained attention, during moments of analysis that border on intimacy. The historian becomes acutely aware of the asymmetry of the situation. They can see the watcher only partially, but the watcher appears to respond as though it sees fully. It knows when it is being studied. It knows when it is being ignored. The most disturbing shift occurs when the historian notices that the watcher's orientation has changed. In early scans, its implied posture faces the mother and child exclusively. In later versions, it angles outward slightly, as though accounting for another observer. The realization arrives slowly, then all at once, sending a wave of cold through the historian's body. The watcher is no longer focused solely on the subjects of the photograph. It is adjusting to the presence of someone else. The image has acquired a second axis of attention. The historian experiments cautiously, opening the file while standing farther from the screen, then closer. Subtle changes follow. When viewed from across the room, the watcher remains static. When examined at close range, its outline darkens, its position marginally altered. The photograph appears to register proximity as well as scrutiny. This suggests a sensitivity not just to attention, but to presence, as though the image functions as a threshold rather than a container. The watcher is not trapped behind the surface. It is oriented toward it. A creeping paranoia sets in, not of immediate harm, but of escalation. If attention draws the watcher nearer within the image, what happens when it reaches the limit of that space? The historian cannot find any precedent, any documented case of an artifact responding dynamically to observation. The absence of framework makes the experience profoundly isolating. There is no protocol for disengagement, no guidance for how to safely stop looking at something that seems to grow more defined the more it is understood. The historian begins to limit interaction, reducing sessions to the bare minimum required for documentation. Yet even this withdrawal feels noticed. During one brief scan conducted after days of avoidance, the watcher's position appears unchanged, but the breathing resumes almost immediately, louder than before, as if registering return rather than discovery. The historian is struck by the impression of patience. Whatever occupies the photograph does not rush. It advances only when invited, secure in the knowledge that curiosity always reasserts itself. What finally settles into certainty is the understanding that the watcher's movement is not random or mechanical. It is relational. It exists in a state of potential, activated by awareness, shaped by focus. The photograph no longer feels like a record of something that happened in 1918, but like an ongoing interaction initiated then and resumed now. The mother's refusal to look back, the careful stillness of her posture, the borrowed peace of the moment all take on new meaning. She was not simply being observed. She was participating in an unspoken agreement, one that required stillness, silence, and above all, restraint from looking too closely at what was standing behind her, because attention is not harmless, and once given, it does not remain contained within the frame. The final understanding does not arrive as a revelation, but as a convergence, the slow alignment of facts that have been circling one another since the beginning. The historian returns to the orphan registry where the baby's name appears, lingering over details that once seemed incidental. The placement date is unusual, delayed beyond what emergency protocols would normally allow. The infant is described as calm, healthy, and remarkably quiet, a detail the clerk felt compelled to note in the margin. There is no mention of distress, no record of illness, no explanation for survival during a period when infants were among the most vulnerable. It reads less like an intake and more like an observation, as though the child arrived already set apart. Seeking anything that might explain this anomaly, the historian follows the baby's paper trail forward through time. Foster records are sparse but consistent. The child moves rarely, remaining in the same care arrangement for years, another deviation from the norm. Letters from caretakers describe an unsettling stillness, not as a complaint, but as something they cannot quite categorize. The child sleeps easily, rarely cries, and seems to watch rooms rather than people. One note mentions that the baby often turns its head toward empty corners, smiling faintly at nothing visible. The caretakers do not dwell on it. They write it off as temperament, as imagination, as anything but significance. What strikes the historian is the absence of illness. During subsequent waves of influenza and other outbreaks, the child remains unaffected. Medical checkups record normal development, strong lungs, steady heartbeat. There is nothing to suggest extraordinary resilience, yet the pattern persists. Survival follows the child like a shadow that never quite detaches. The historian begins to understand that the watcher's role may not have been predatory in the conventional sense. Its attention did not culminate in death for the baby. It culminated in preservation. The mother's disappearance, when re-examined through this lens, takes on a different and more terrible meaning. The evacuation records, the silence that follows her name, the lack of any attempt to locate her afterward all suggest not an accident, but a conclusion. She did not simply vanish. She was removed from the narrative, her absence accepted too quickly by a system overwhelmed and eager to forget what it could not manage. The photograph becomes the last moment in which she exists as herself, holding her child, fully aware of what is behind her. The historian revisits the image with this understanding in mind, noticing details that previously escaped notice. The mother's grip on the baby is firm, almost desperate, her fingers pressing protectively into fabric. Her body angles subtly away from the watcher, yet she does not flee, does not react overtly. This is not ignorance. It is negotiation. The stillness of the moment begins to resemble an offering, a pause held long enough to matter. The watcher's presence no longer reads as purely invasive. It reads as expectant. The audio recordings, when replayed alongside this realization, sound different. The breathing is not labored now, but measured, patient. It does not convey hunger or urgency. It conveys waiting. The historian notices that the deepest, clearest breaths occur when the baby is most visible on the screen, when the scan lingers on the child's face. When focus shifts to the mother, the sound softens, receding slightly, as though the watcher's interest narrows with precision. It was never there for both of them equally. The implication settles heavily. The watcher did not arrive by chance, nor was it summoned by catastrophe alone. It was drawn to something specific, something newly arrived and fragile. The epidemic, the overcrowded ward, the confusion of evacuation all provided cover, but they were not the cause. The cause was the baby, and whatever potential the watcher recognized within it. The historian resists the urge to frame this as benevolence or malice, understanding instead that such categories may not apply. The watcher intervened, but intervention does not imply compassion. The mother's role becomes clearer with painful clarity. She understood that the watcher's attention could not be denied, only directed. By holding the child, by remaining still, by refusing to acknowledge what stood behind her, she controlled the terms of that attention for as long as she could. The photograph captures the exact balance point of that effort, the last moment in which all conditions are met. Afterward, during the chaos of evacuation, the balance breaks. The watcher's focus resolves. The child is separated. The mother is no longer necessary. This understanding reframes the watcher's behavior in the present. Its movement within the photograph, its response to attention, its growing orientation toward the historian all follow the same logic. It responds to those who notice it, but it commits only when something is offered. In 1918, that offering was a mother's willingness to remain, to be erased so her child could continue. In the present, the offering is awareness itself, sustained focus that allows the watcher to draw closer, to assess, to decide. The historian begins to question their own role in this pattern. The baby survived because someone else paid the cost. That cost was not recorded, not acknowledged, but it was absolute. The watcher did not take indiscriminately. It selected, balanced, exchanged. The photograph is not merely evidence of observation, but documentation of a transaction completed long ago and echoed now through renewed attention. The historian's study, their curiosity, their refusal to look away mirrors the mother's stillness in ways that become increasingly uncomfortable. The final piece of the puzzle emerges not from archives, but from absence. There are no further references to the watcher beyond this photograph. No other images, no corroborating accounts, no folklore that fits cleanly. It appears only here, bound to this moment, this child. That suggests finality rather than repetition. The watcher made its choice and withdrew, leaving behind a trace that would remain inert unless disturbed. The historian's work has disturbed it. As the implications settle, the photograph feels less like a haunting and more like a warning encoded in silver and shadow. Survival is not always free. Sometimes it is sponsored by attention that must be paid in full. The baby's long, untouched life stands as proof of a bargain honored. The mother's disappearance stands as proof of the price. And the watcher's renewed responsiveness suggests that such exchanges are not limited to the past, that they can be reopened, reactivated, if someone looks long enough and closely enough to be noticed again.